Please be seated. Now I think we have Ms Murray. We don't have Ms Murray?
Yes.
Oh, we do have her. Sorry, you beat me. Ms Murray, would you mind stating your full name for the record?
Rachel Claire Murray.
And do you wish to affirm or swear an oath?
Affirm, please. I, Rachel Claire Murray, sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence I give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Please sit down, Mr Gandhi.
May it please the Commission appear for Ms Murray.
Please.
Ms Murray, you prepared a statement dated 16th of September in response to a summons dated the 9th of September. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
You see a copy of your statement on the screen. The reference should be CRW 998-002-0600. Is that the first page of your statement?
Yes, it is.
Could I take you to page 12 of the statement, the reference to the page ending 0611 at the top? Is that a schedule RM1 that lists out the training that you've taken?
Yes, it is.
Ms Murray, is your statement true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Great. Commissioners, I tendered that statement.
Thank you, Mr Gandhi. The witness statement of Rachel Claire Murray dated the 16th of September 2021 and bearing the identifier number CRW 998.002.0600 is admitted into evidence as an exhibit. Thank you. Mr Futrell.
May it please the Commission. Ms Murray, my name is Michael Futrell. I'm one of the counsel assisting the Commission. I'll ask you some questions. And just before I do, I've just noticed you are speaking quite quietly. So if you try and remember to speak up and project your voice a little so that the transcribers can pick up what you're saying and answer to my questions. Can I ask you first a couple of questions about your statement. You were appointed, or you began to work with the Crown Perth in, I think you said, January 2008.
Yes, that's correct.
And who was the person who employed you?
That was Alison Hill at the time. She was the internal audit manager.
So you had your interview with the internal audit manager, and
Yes, that's correct.
did you have an interview with anyone else at the time?
No, I think it was just Alison.
And who undertook your performance reviews each year?
That would have been Alison as well, yeah.
And after she left and you were appointed the internal audit manager, who was the person who made that appointment?
That would have been Mr Preston.
Mr Preston. And with whom did you have any performance reviews during the period you were the internal audit manager?
Mr Preston.
Were there any occasions when you dealt with anyone from the board of Burswood Limited in respect of either your appointment as the manager or the terms of your salary? So your terms of employment. Did you have any dealings directly with the board of Burswood Limited in relation to your appointment as the manager of internal audit?
No, not that I can recall.
And in regard to your terms of employment, things like the salary and so forth, did you have any dealings directly with the members of the Burswood Limited board on that subject matter?
No, not that I recall.
Now, can I ask that you be shown a document? You've made reference, I don't know if you've actually made reference to this, but it's CRW.701.001.1404. I take it you are familiar, or you were familiar with the internal audit charter. At the time you were the internal audit manager.
The screen doesn't show the internal audit charter.
It shows an agenda.
Oh,
yes, that's right.
Yep.
I'll take it to the pinpoint.
Yep.
I'm just showing you this. There is an agenda. The pinpoint is 1426.
Yes.
There's the reason for showing the first page is it was an agenda in May, and I can tell you from the minutes that this was effectively, it was approved by the ERCC. I just want to ask you some questions about this document, Ms. Murray. So under the, and I think you've made reference in your statement in paragraph 50 to the international standards for the for audit, and that's the same standard referred to under the heading professional standards, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
And there's a heading independence which speaks to your independence.
Yes.
Now, under that heading, it says there that the internal audit manager is administratively responsible to the executive general manager, legal and corporate services.
Yes.
That's Mr. Preston you're referring to there.
Correct. Yes.
And administratively responsible, what precisely does that mean?
So Mr. Preston, as we mentioned, would do my performance reviews. I would liaise with him on our internal audit budget, any specific training, performance of the team, and generally just providing with updates on the status of the audit plan and if we were finding any specific issues in relation to the audits. So I would meet with Mr. Preston on a fortnightly basis.
I see. So do I take it from that, the answer to that question, that Mr. Preston was responsible for the internal audit budget as part of his responsibilities as the manager?
It sat under Mr. Preston, but I was responsible for the budget.
As in identifying what was required in the budget?
Yes, I would determine. It was only a small budget, but it would be around professional memberships for the team, training that was required for the team for the year. So I would determine what amounts we would need for those things for the year and provide that to Mr. Preston to be as part of the budget for the department. But it was only a small budget.
Right. When you say a small budget, so what about membership of the number of people who you had access to carry out internal audits? Who were members of the internal audit team? Did you have control over that?
In terms of how many
Employees,
members of the team I had?
FTEs or yes.
It was not really in my control as such. I think when I took over as internal audit manager, there was only a couple of auditors, myself and another auditor who was part of the team, but that then did increase, but that was an executive decision to get those additional roles within my team. So.
And when you say an executive decision, who made that decision?
I can't recall, I'm sorry.
Was that as a consequence of you requesting additional resources, or was it something that was bestowed on you?
Something that was bestowed on me.
And so insofar as that aspect of the budget that you controlled, was that limited, was it, to things like the degree, annual training, courses and that sort of thing that you thought your membership needed for that year?
Yeah, that's correct.
All right. Now, it makes reference there to reporting directly to the Chief Executive Officer. Yes. And the Executive Risk and Compliance Committee, which I'm going to refer to from now on as the ERCC. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So when it says report directly to the Chief Executive Officer, that was Mr. Felstead at the time?
Correct, yeah.
And I think you've made reference in your statement to attending meetings of the ERCC by invitation.
Yes, that's correct.
And is that what's referred to by reporting directly to the ERCC?
Yes.
I see. Now, there's a reference here to having direct access to the General Counsel and Chief Financial Officer of Crown Resorts Limited.
Yep, that's correct.
you have said in your statement, I think in at least one place, that you before ERCC meetings met with or had discussions with Mr. Felstead and Mr. Nielsen.
Mr. Barton and Mr.
Oh, sorry,
Nielsen.
Mr. Barton and Mr.
Yeah,
Nielsen.
Mr. Barton was the CFO at the time. Yeah.
So, and so it was your practice to meet with them before ERCC meetings and discuss the subject matter of the internal audit.
It was after the ERCC meeting, so we would hold the ERCC meeting and then a couple of days afterwards, I think, or a week afterwards, we would then have a teleconference with Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Barton, and I'd effectively go through the same report that I presented to the ERCC and would present it also and go through it with them via telephone.
All right. So were there occasions when Mr. Barton was at the ERCC meetings as well?
As in physically in the room?
Physically or via telephone or
No.
something.
No.
And does that apply to Mr. Nielsen as well, does it?
Yeah, that's correct.
So in effect, you were reporting once to the ERCC, which was I think Mr. Felstead was on the ERCC and Mr. Preston, and then again on a separate occasion to Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, I'll just take you to the next page at point 427, 1427.
Yep.
And at the top of that page, it indicates that the position, which is your position you occupied, was accountable to the ERCC. And a little further down the page, after those various bullet points, it deals with, it talks about an action plan, which I'm making an assumption is a strategic action plan for each year. So this is the second major paragraph after the end of the bullet points. Management is responsible for risk management. And then it goes on to say this includes responsibility for implementing
Action plans. Those action plans are the within each individual internal audit report. So each report would have actions for management to implement.
I see.
So the audit actions, yeah, that's what that's referring to.
I see.
Yes.
I see, as endorsed by that. So these are the plans that went to the ERC. These are the actions that arose out of internal audits that were then endorsed by the ERC for implementation.
Yes.
I see, I understand. And can I take you to the next page? This is point 428, 1428. There's a heading reporting.
Yes.
And I think we may have touched on this already, Ms. Murray. This is dealing with the process by which you attended as an invitee to the ERCC meetings. So you were making reports directly to the ERCC.
Yes.
And you were reporting against the progress on recommendations to the ERCC as well.
Yes, that's correct.
And then there's a next paragraph. It discusses or deals with providing periodic reports to the executive, to the ERCC, and the Burswood Limited Board on the progress of internal audit activities. In what way were you providing periodic reports to the Burswood Limited Board?
So that was the internal audit activity report that I prepared for each ERCC meeting. Subsequently, I discussed that exact report with Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Barton. And then that report, my understanding is that report then went as part of the Burswood Board pack for the meetings, my internal audit activity report.
When you say it was your understanding, is that because you did not yourself attend any Burswood meetings and
Correct.
present
Correct.
your findings in your reports to the board directly?
No, I didn't.
Did you have any direct access to any of the other members of the Burswood Board? And by that I mean to say the independent directors at the time, Mr. Poynton or Mr. Roberts?
No.
Did you have any interactions with them at all during the period of time that you were the internal audit manager? And what of the chair of the birds within the board at the time, which I think during your period would have been initially maybe Mr. Packer and then perhaps Mr. Alexander? Did you have any direct dealings with either of those gentlemen? All right, so then the charter does actually make reference in the next paragraph, I think, to those meetings you have mentioned between yourself and Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen, which is essentially the meeting, the pre Burswood Limited board meeting.
Yes.
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 Could I mentioned the standards. Can I just ask you to look at paragraph 50 of your statement?
Yeah. Yes.
And you have made reference to the Institute of Internal Auditors International Standards, which I will come back to in due course, but you've also made reference in that paragraph to arranging for an independent assessment by that organisation to be carried out.
Yes.
And I think you said you don't have a copy of it. I think we've located a copy of it. So if I could ask that you be shown CRW .701.005.8210. If you need to scroll through this at all, Ms. Murray, feel free to do so. I just want to see if this is the document that you are making reference to in that paragraph. Perhaps we could have
Can you scroll down a bit?
Yes, the second page might
Thank you.
assist.
Yes, that looks like it. Yes.
Thank you. All right, now, I'll stay with your statement for a moment and take you back in it to paragraph 44. Operator, you can hang on to that, you can keep that document there because we'll move it in a moment. You've got a copy in front of you, so it's in paragraph 44 of your statement. You've indicated that there are effectively, if you like, two aspects in the first sentence to the compliance framework. There is a management aspect, which is monitoring and assessing through supervisory and monitoring controls, and that's a management responsibility. And then you've indicated that internal audit also assess compliance and effectiveness of controls to mitigate risks as part of the audits conducted in accordance with the strategic audit plan.
Yes.
Are you there describing, are you familiar with the concept of the 3 lines of defence?
Yes.
And that's one of the models of the Internal Auditors Institute, or Institute of Internal Auditors.
Yes. Yes.
And am I right in thinking that the first sentence of that paragraph is really describing the first 2 lines of defence, which are the, if you like, the management responsibility, and the third line of defence there is that of the internal audit?
Yes.
Could I ask that we call up PUB.007.0031.0031, please? Are you familiar with this document, or were you once familiar with this document?
Yes.
what we've just, if I could scroll to page 0.0005. What we've just, I think, been addressing are principle 3 and principle 4 on that page. And then there's principle 5, which is the third line independence.
Yes.
And I'll just draw your attention to that paragraph. Would you accept that's one of the major principles of internal audit?
Yes.
That there's independence?
Yes.
And could I just ask then if you accept this proposition as well? So if we could scroll to 0.0009. And there's a heading between management, both first and second line roles and internal audit. There's a fairly long paragraph there, which I'd ask you just to consider. I'll ask you a question about that. It starts independent auditors is independent from management ensures, etc.
Yes. Yep.
So would you accept that's an accurate summary of what the if you like, the interaction between management and independent audit should be in an organisation, that it is to the Institute of Internal Auditors Standards?
Yes. Yes.
Right. And can I just show you the next page, which I think is at 0010. And ask you to just draw your attention to the two paragraphs under between internal audit and the governing body. Do you accept those propositions as well, that the internal audit should be effectively the eyes and ears of the governing body?
Yes.
When you were in the position of internal manager or internal audit manager, who did you consider to be the governing body for whom you were to be the eyes and ears?
I guess that would be the Burswood board.
Burswood Limited Board. All right. The charter required you to report to the ERCC, and the ERCC, you were effectively responsible or to the ERCC. You attended its meetings as an invitee. You were not a permanent member of the ERCC, were you?
No.
You presented reports to that committee periodically. Were you invited to, and did you ever make presentations to the Burswood Limited Board?
No.
What of the Crown Resort Limited Board? Were there any committees of the Crown Resorts Limited Board itself to which you made any direct presentations?
No.
All right, and you also attended the Legal and Compliance Committee meetings as an invitee as well,
Yes.
and you were not a permanent member of that.
Possibly was. I can't recall. The reason I put invitee is because I didn't prepare a compliance certificate as part of the meeting, but I'm not sure what the terms of reference says as to whether I was, if I was a member or an invitee. I'm not sure.
All right,
But I
again.
attended most meetings. Sorry, speak up.
Speak up,
Sorry.
yes.
So that's why I put invitee, because I don't actually prepare a compliance certificate.
Right.
But I can't recall what it says in the terms of reference for that committee, if I was a member or invitee, or I'm not sure.
I see. What was your participation in that committee for?
Well, really, listening to any of the issues that have been raised by the relevant compliance officers across the business within that forum was really important for internal audit to be across anything that had occurred. Potentially, we might need to have a look at something or get involved in something. So it was a way of me being informed as to any compliance matters within the business.
And was that part of the information that you used to inform you about what areas of the business may require an audit?
It would have been potentially one of the factors.
And prioritising the areas that required audit?
Yes, that would have been one of the reasons for why we would do an audit. If there'd been some issues in a certain area, we might prioritise that audit in the plan.
And do you have any recollection of there being a fairly regular degree of non-compliance in the cage area?
Not that I can recall.
Can I take you to paragraph 42 of your statement? I just want to ask you a question about what you mean in that paragraph. Are you intending to say there that in effect you were precluded from obtaining competent advice and assistance if the internal auditors lacked knowledge, skills or other competencies to perform all or any part of an audit?
Sorry, could you repeat?
So just in paragraph 42 you've indicated it wasn't part of your role to obtain external advice.
Yes.
The question I'm asking you is whether if the internal audit team lacked the skills or other competencies to perform a particular audit, are you suggesting that it was outside the scope of your remit to obtain external assistance to make up for any deficiencies in that area in your internal audit?
The way the audit plan was established was to ensure that the scope of the audit was we had the skills internally to perform those audits. Where it was an audit where it did need expertise, then it wouldn't be an audit that we would do. It would be an audit that would be outsourced to a relevant party. That's how it would work.
So if you formed the view that you did not have the requisite internal skills or competence, you'd obtain a third party to undertake that particular audit?
Yes, yeah. The plan will be set based on what we have the skills in-house to perform.
Okay, and were there occasions when you did engage a third party to undertake an audit in a particular area?
Not that I can recall, no.
So is your evidence that you would have done that had the occasion arisen, or is your evidence, I know it did happen, I just can't remember exactly when?
We would have done that if we needed to, yes, absolutely.
but that's not answering the question. So
Sorry.
Do you have what I'm asking is, do you have a recollection of it actually taking place, not specifically, generally, or it's just you're hypothesising if the need had arisen? That's what you would have done.
I was hypothesising. I don't recall an example.
I see. So for the time that you were the internal audit manager then, for all audits, you considered that your audit team had the requisite skills and competence to carry out the audits?
Yes, based on the scopes. There was an IT audit function within Crown Melbourne, so they would have specialised IT auditors that they would do specific audits, which would cover Crown Perth and Crown Melbourne. So from an IT, which was quite a specialised role, that would be done through the function in Melbourne.
Okay.
So that's...
Could I ask, I want to take you to two parts of your statement now. One is paragraph 32, where you've made reference to your training records.
Yes.
And then I think the training records are attached to your statement at RM1.
Yep.
And following. Can I, first of all, either you have a photographic memory or you've got a record somewhere for this.
Yeah, obviously. I've always kept a record of any training that I've done throughout my tenure at Crown and beyond, just to evidence continued professional development in terms of the training that I've attended. So this is my personal log, if you like.
I see. So
Yeah.
you maintain your own personal log?
Yes.
And is it your usual practice that whenever you have training, it
Yeah.
goes in your log?
Yes.
It's quite comprehensive. I'm interested in asking you a question. So I've been through this and I've found one entry to anti-money laundering, counter-terrorism financing.
Yes.
It's on page .0612.
Yep.
And it refers to a Crown Perth internal online training course on the 2nd of June 2015 for a quarter of an hour, 15 minutes.
Yep.
Am I right then in thinking that that's the only AML CTF training you received for the entire period of your employment with Crown Perth?
No, this log only starts at 2011. There would have been prior training on AML because I started in 2008. Definitely would have been AML when I started, and then there was refreshers. So that there would have been I would have done that training more than once.
I see. And
Yeah.
when you say you would have done that training more than once, do you mean you would have done online training more than once?
Yes, the AML online training course. Yes.
Did you undertake any more extensive training in AML CTF? And you don't need to confine yourself now to your period of employment with Crown, but at any point prior to, during your studies, or at Crown?
Not that I can recall.
And what of the other members of the internal audit team? Were you aware of the degree to which each of them had received training in AML and CTF?
I believe they would have only have done the Crown Perth online training.
Right. Can I ask you some questions now about the strategic audit plan? And you've referred to this in a number of places in your statement. But I just want to get a sense of this process by taking you to one of the plans, so we can see that, make it, if you like, a more live explanation.
Okay.
So you referred to it in paragraphs 40, 52 and 53. Can I ask that we call up CRW .701, .001.201 2. And the pinpoint is 0.2044. This is taken from an agenda pack for the ERCC meetings in July or thereabouts, 2016. And it's an example of a strategic audit strategic audit plan. Now, I wanted to try and juggle two things if I can with you. One is paragraph 53 of your statement and the other is this document. And in paragraph 53, in the chapeau, if I can use that French expression, to paragraph 53, you make reference to it diagrammatically setting out the process in the strategic audit plan. If I could take you to pinpoint 0.2045, there's a diagram under a heading planning process.
Yes.
And am I right in thinking that's the or a version of the diagram you had in mind in paragraph 53?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, so if I could I would just like to take you through this and clarify some things, because it doesn't always seem to align perfectly with your paragraph 53.
Okay. No worries.
So you've got 53A appears to be the first box. We review the corporate risk profile and related controls.
Yes.
That's really dealing with things in that first box. Then in 53B, there's a reference there to interviewing key management and so forth. And you've mentioned that in 53B.
Yes.
And 53C seems to be dealing also with the second box. Am I right?
The audit profiles. They're, as part of the second box of the planning process.
Yep.
Key management. It's probably not part of the planning process as such, but it's within the strategic audit plan. It would have a high level statement of the objectives of the audit, which I would discuss with management in terms of, at a high level, what we would look at. So potentially, yes, that might get updated in the strategic audit plan as part of my discussions with management.
Okay.
Yep.
And then D, considering resourcing, that's under the second box too, is it not? Operational requirements.
That would more refer to departments we were auditing and what their requirements were in terms of coverage. That's probably outside of that for me to look at what internal resources I have to deliver on the plan.
When would you consider internal resources then?
Audit results. Probably as part of the analysis. So in terms of prioritise audit areas, and then we consider resourcing.
All right. Now, in paragraph 53B, you have mentioned that
yes,
at the meetings with the managers, there will be an agreement on the audits you wanted to include in the strategic audit plan.
Mm-hmm.
The diagram suggests a slightly different process, which is that you undertake an interview with key management.
Yes.
And then in the third box, after undertaking your analysis, you prioritise auditable areas. Mm-hmm. So it creates the impression that you are making the decision after consultation with the management about what areas the audit would be audited.
Yes.
Which of those competing models, if you like, was the correct one?
So I would catch up with each executive and we'd review the audit areas that sat within their responsibility and go through what we've had in the previous plan to decide if we needed to do the audit again the following year. So that we'd look at what the previous audit results had been and things like that, if anything had appeared that we needed to have more coverage. So we'd go through each area and decide between us what audits we should have in the plan. I'd already have an idea in my head. It was to go through and discuss it with them when I went to sit with them.
So it's more, what you're saying is it's more consistent with what you described in your statement, that you would reach agreement with the internal managers about what audits will be carried out each year.
Yes. Yes.
So the question really for me is, my understanding of the audit process the internal auditor would make a decision about what audits would be undertaken after consultation, not by agreement with management.
I guess it was a two-way discussion around the audit plan. Yeah, it would be in consultation with them, particularly if there was any new areas that we needed to capture. I needed to be aware of anything that was coming up in that year where we might need internal audit coverage that might hadn't been on the plan previously. So it was, I would have an idea when I went to see them, we'd have a discussion, that would likely change, we'd probably increase it if anything in terms of do more audits, and I would do that with each executive, and then I would formulate based on resourcing how we would formulate that plan.
Did you feel free to depart from any agreement you reached with management about what areas you would audit?
In terms of not doing an audit, or
if you decided that a particular area required an audit and they were resisting that?
It was more the opposite. It was more they wanted me to do more than what I was trying to plan. If anything, there was rationale as to why we did certain audits, lots of audits we did every year anyway, because of the high risk of those areas. So there wouldn't be a discussion around, oh, let's not do that this year. There were certain audits that we always did every year regardless, even if we had good results the prior year. So there was a number of factors that were taken into account to determine what we would audit each year.
Okay, now can I take you back to the diagram? And clearly after you'd spoken to all management, they all have differing views about what should be done for their departments and so forth.
Yes.
You had, I take it, a finite resource available to carry out the audits?
Yes.
So in the box under analysis of auditable areas and prioritising audit areas, who undertook that role? The role of identifying which ones we done, what order, and which were most important?
We did. I did.
So we say we?
Internal audit.
Is that your decision alone?
In terms of prioritising audits, in consultation with management, like I said, most of them we would do every year anyway, due to the high risk of some of the audit areas.
You said in consultation with management. So is this a if you like, an iterative process? You're having one meeting about audits in general, you come up with your list of priorities, and then they're having input into which ones are prioritised as well?
No, we would prioritise as part of that one discussion that we would catch up each year and discuss those audits.
What happens when you've got competing interests of different managers?
Yeah. So in terms of, obviously I've got a limited resource. The one thing we did have in the plan as well was a continuous spot check audit allocation, as well as management requests. So although the plan was set each year, we had flexibility in some of the audit areas we could look at. So what we might do is, if we weren't doing audit that year, we might do a continuous audit, which is more of a spot check audit. So we'd get some coverage of that area and maybe look at a particular issue or particular problem we've had previously when we've done an audit. So we might not do a full audit, which takes 10, 15 days to do. We might do a reduced scope and look at a particular area of concern. So we had a bit of flexibility in the plan in terms of these are your standard full audits, if you like, that we would do each year, but then we would have flexibility around if there were specific management requests, if something had occurred throughout the year, or if we wanted to do more of a spot check audit. So that would how I would balance that time and resource in terms of the audits that we did.
Can I ask you about spot checks and things occurring in the course of a year?
Yes.
Are you saying that there was effectively allocated within your time budget, if I could put it that way, enough slack that if something occurred during the course of a year, you could undertake an ad hoc audit of that?
Yes, absolutely. There was an allocation each year in the plan for unplanned audits, management requests. There was an allocation of time for that always in the plan, so we had that flexibility.
And when an issue like that arose, did you need to obtain approval from anyone before you carried out a spot check audit?
In terms of a management request?
Yes, so for example, a manager requested, said, this event's occurred, can you please carry out an audit?
Yeah, no, I just look at it, I wouldn't need authority.
In the period that you were the internal audit manager, were there any occasions upon which Mr. Preston asked you to carry out a spot check audit in respect of AML and CTF?
Not that I recall a spot check audit. That was a standard audit. AML CTF was a standard audit we had in the plan anyway. So outside of that planned audit, no.
I'm referring to as any specific aspect of the AML CTF program that he wished you to look at more closely?
Not that I recall.
And was one of the managers with whom you had your annual catch-up, if you like, to do with audit, the general manager of Cage and Count?
No, I don't believe I would have caught up with him because all the Cage audits we did every year anyway. The Cage would have sat, I believe, under Mr. Preston during my tenure, so I would have discussed Cage audits with Mr. Preston.
All right. And what about the finance department? Was there anyone in the finance department with whom you had direct contact in scoping audits?
So I would discuss the audit areas with the Chief Financial Officer, which would have been Alan McGregor while I was there. And then specific scoping of audits would be done in conjunction with the financial controller and relevant managers in the team. All
right. Now, in the period that you were the internal audit manager, were there any occasions upon which you were requested to carry out any ad hoc audit of AML CTF issues that related to the telegraphic transfers in the Cage?
No.
Let's come back to the strategic plan for 2016. I got slightly sidetracked, Ms. Murray, and ask you some more questions about your statement. I'm just trying to understand again the final approval stage, which is the last box. I take it you prepared a draft strategic audit plan.
Yes, that's correct.
after all of the process we've been
Yes.
talking about. And it says in the document, in diagram, it refers to obtain confirmation from CEO. I take that to be Mr. Felsted.
Mr. Felsted, yes.
Felsted, sorry, and EGM Legal and Corporate Services. That's Mr. Preston.
Yes.
So when it refers to obtain confirmation, is that does that mean their approval for the strategic audit plan?
They would just review the draft to make sure they were comfortable with that before it was provided to the ERCC is missing off this diagram, so it should then say ERCC and then board.
So that last bullet point, which is obtain approval from the board, the capital B board there, that board, do you understand that? How do we read board there? What body are we talking about?
Burswood board.
Burswood Limited.
Yes, I believe so.
All right. So, and that, I take it, just to be clear, is also when one looks at the executive summary on the same page under the heading 1.1 introduction. In the second paragraph, it talks about providing Crown Perth management and the board of directors with assurance and confidence. That board there is, again, the Burswood Limited board you're referring to.
Yes, correct.
But in terms of the process by which the strategic audit plan was approved, you did not yourself attend any board meetings of Burswood Limited and present your plan. I'll ask you another question on your statement, Ms. Murray. This is paragraph 34.
Yes.
And you might be able to assist me, Ms. Murray. It's something that is perplexing me about risk management.
Yes.
And it's the expression risk appetite
Yes.
statement. And you indicated there that during the period of your employment there was no defined risk appetite statement of Crown Perth. Can you explain in your own words, and as simply as you can, what you understand the meaning of risk appetite to be?
So when I refer to risk appetite statement, I mean an actual documented statement in terms of what risk is accepted within the business. So this is kind of a maturity around risk management. So at the time I was at Crown Perth, I don't believe there was an actual formal statement around what the board's appetite is to risk, what they're willing to accept. As risk management's evolved over the years, this is becoming more businesses are looking to develop statements. The current business I work in does have one, so it's a defined statement around, depending on certain factors, what risk appetite is acceptable.
You might, it's quite abstract what you just said, so can you give a concrete example of what you mean by factors and defined?
So it would be based on the different consequences of a risk. So for instance, in terms of health and safety, we have a low appetite for there being any injuries or any harm to people. Whereas in other areas of consequence, we might have depend on certain factors, we might have a not bigger appetite. We might tolerate more in terms of risk.
So financial risk, for example, you might tolerate more risk in your financial well-being than the health and safety of employees.
Potentially, yeah, as an example. Yeah.
And would the risk appetite statement make a statement to that effect, would it?
From what
From your
I've,
experience?
from my experience and what I know, that's what I've seen. Yes.
Sorry, Mr. Futrell, can I just, in your statement, you say you've been in internal audit for about 16 years,
Yes.
from about 2001.
Yes.
When you talk about risk appetite as a discrete document, what's been your experience in that entire period from 2001 on as to, is this a more modern phenomenon?
That I'm aware of, I haven't seen it before until my more recent role. It's not easy to write an appetite statement, but there are companies that do have them, which are endorsed at that board level. So management are aware of whether or not how they're managing their risks is acceptable in terms of the tolerances set by the board.
So the absence of a discrete document,
Yes.
was that a surprise to you? If we're talking about this period 2013 and around there?
A surprise in terms of there wasn't one, is that
Yes.
what you mean? No, it wasn't a surprise. I wouldn't have been aware of it back then either.
All right, thank you.
Staying with this topic though,
Yes.
Ms. Mo, one internal audit activity is to evaluate the effectiveness and contribute to the improvement of the risk management processes, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And that requires a degree of understanding of risk appetite for the organisation for whom you're the internal auditor.
Yes.
And it also no doubt requires an understanding of what you might call the organisational mission or the strategic goals of the organisation. Correct?
Yes.
So in the period that you were the internal audit manager and the absence of any documented statement of risk appetite,
Mm-hmm.
on what basis did you evaluate the effectiveness of Crown Perth risk management system or processes?
In terms of risk management, in terms of looking at risk management as a specific audit,
Yes.
don't recall us actually doing a risk management audit during my.
I was going to ask you about that because
Yeah.
there is a risk, each strategic plan I think I've read,
Yes.
there's a reference to a enterprise risk policy as one of the audits,
Yes.
and it does not appear ever to be
have
done.
been
It continually was deferred.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recollection or appreciation for why that particular audit was deferred continually?
I think we were comfortable with the framework that was in place, and that it was working well. Although we didn't do a specific risk management audit as part of our individual audits that we did do, we looked at the risk registers that were maintained by management. We reviewed those risk registers as part of the audit planning process. So it wasn't to say we weren't aware of or didn't have a look at anything to do with risk management. We did as part of our process of doing audits. So there was coverage, if you like, even if we weren't specifically doing a risk management audit. So I guess it was just seen as low priority, considering the broad the scope of the strategic audit plan covering the whole complex, and the areas of audit that we could do. I guess it was seen as low priority.
All right, thank you. Can I ask you, just if we're still in the strategic audit plan, which I hope we are, to go to pinpoint 0.2050. And there's a heading internal audit resources, and you might recall I asked you some questions about this a little earlier. Is this description of the full complement of people available for internal audit for the period you were the internal audit manager?
That was the resources that I had at the time of preparing this plan prior to leaving. The bottom two bullets, those roles weren't there when I first started.
Right.
So those came into play during my tenure as internal audit manager. So originally when I started it was just the top three.
I see. And the bottom two, are they the ones I use the expression bestowed on you by management?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Now,
Yes.
Up until the point at which you received the additional assistance, in your view, was the full complement you then had available sufficient resource to carry out the audit program you had each year?
You could always have more resources. Probably not. Being in the internal audit manager role, you don't get a lot of time to do audits yourself. So in terms of you being able to do audits, there's other matters that you have to deal with. So you've really just got a full-time and a part-time auditor doing those audits. And the occasional audit would be done by internal audit managers. So considering the breadth of the business, we covered the whole complex, and the audits would cover those areas. You know, potentially we could have had. Always nice to have more resource.
Well, it was pretty frequent or pretty regular that you didn't complete the full complement of audits each year, wasn't it?
There was always audits we didn't complete each year. Yes.
And that would suggest, wouldn't it, that the resources available for the ambition in the audit plan may not have been adequate?
The plan was set based on the resources. The reason why it wasn't always achieved was, you do the best you can in terms of estimate how much time you would need to complete each audit. But sometimes, particularly where you'd find some issues within an audit, then you might need to dig and look at more information, which would obviously take longer to perform the audit and complete the audit and the audit report. So we would track our time on what we would spend on the audit, so I had visibility of how we were doing, and we would catch up as a team each month and review that to see how we're tracking in terms of time. The ultimate goal was to achieve the strategic audit plan, but you had to balance that out with making sure that the audits were complete and detailed as possible. So if you did find issues, then you would take longer. So I'd be aware of that, so we could then look at the plan and go, where can we compromise in terms of time?
Okay. You a little earlier you said something, where's the effect that it's always nice to have more resources. Yeah. And I understand that.
Yeah.
Insofar as your position as the internal audit manager went,
Mm-hmm.
did you feel you were in a position to request additional resources?
Yes, I could request.
And to whom would you have made such a request, or did you make such a request?
That request would have been with Mr. Preston, probably.
And did you consider yourself to be able to, if you like, knock on the door of the members of the board and ask them for additional resources? When I say board, I mean the Burswood Limited board.
No, I wouldn't be comfortable doing that.
And why would you not have been comfortable doing that?
I don't know.
Well, did you have was there any way in which you directly had the ability to make contact, if you like, telephone, email, or any other way, informally or formally, with the independent directors of Burswood Limited? By that I mean Mr. Poynton or Mr. Roberts.
No, I don't believe so.
And what about the chairman of the board?
No.
take you back to your statement now, Ms Murray, and there's a couple of questions I've got relating to the audit of junkets. In paragraphs 37 and 38, you describe a couple of aspects of junkets.
Yes.
You indicate that they were principally managed out of Melbourne in paragraph 37. And then in paragraph 38, you have said in the second last sentence in that paragraph that you had no visibility over the way in which Crown Melbourne International Operations Team operated, and you were not involved in the internal audit of that department.
Yes.
Do I understand from that sentence what you are saying is that you, as the internal audit manager in Perth, did not have access to the records of Crown Melbourne relating to the International Commission business or junkets?
No, that would have been the Crown Melbourne internal audit team that would have audited that aspect.
All right. Now, was it your understanding that there were junket operators who were operating in Perth, but their approval to operate in Perth was undertaken in Melbourne?
I can't recall if there was an approval in Perth and Melbourne. I can't recall, sorry.
Can't recall, it was in both or one or the other?
I can't remember that.
And what about with respect to junket representatives, those who represented the junket operators in Perth?
I know there was an approval process, but I can't remember who was involved in that process, unfortunately.
Do you recall whether the internal audit was involved at any time in undertaking an audit of the approval process for junket operators in Perth or junket representatives in Perth?
Yes, yes.
There were such audits?
We had a junkets audit on the audit plan, so that would have included confirming the junkets were approved and the approval process had been followed in relation to what was documented in Crown Perth's casino manual. Outside of that would have been outside of the scope.
Right. So if and to the extent that approval process was within the management of Crown Melbourne, it was not something you were able to audit as the internal audit manager of Perth. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. If we would have had approval documentation in Perth from Melbourne, we would have cited that, but we wouldn't have reached out to Melbourne to obtain any documentation to do the audit.
What I'm driving at is a material risk of Crown Perth, no doubt, was the process by which it approved junket operators and junket representatives. And if you can't remember, this is fine, but I'm interested to know what information you had available to you to assure the board of Burswood Limited that appropriate processes had been undertaken to mitigate that risk for Crown Perth.
I can't recall the specifics of what we would have actually looked at as part of that audit. As I said, it would have been in line with the procedures within Crown Perth's casino manual.
All right, now, so again, if and to the extent that you required records from Crown Melbourne to complete that audit, it would have been impaired, would it not, by your inability to access Crown Melbourne's records?
Sorry, could you repeat that question?
What I mean to say is, to carry out a complete and thorough, if it's the case, to carry out a complete and thorough audit of the junket operations in Perth, if you needed access to Crown Melbourne's records, they were not available to you, were they?
I could access the records if I required as part of the audit, but I don't recall ever doing that. But I would say any documents relevant to the Crown Perth compliance with the procedures, which they would have had a copy at Perth for us to cite if that was the case.
So what do you mean then by you had no visibility over the way in which Crown Melbourne operated and was not involved in?
So I didn't audit anything to do with Crown Melbourne, it was purely Crown Perth. So in terms of the procedures that were followed by their international operations team in terms of their own processes around junkets and the representatives and the like, the junket programs and the various options around the junket programs and what program the players would be on, that was all kind of managed through that Melbourne team. Crown Perth would get advised of what had been agreed on certain aspects for those players, and we would audit based on that documentation that would have been provided to Crown Perth.
Okay, thank you. Commissioners, I'm about to move to a different topic. Now would be a convenient time.
All right, and we'll come back at 11:30. So we'll have a break, Ms. Murray, until 11:30.
All rise.
Please sit down, Murray.
Ms. Murray, can I ask you to turn to paragraph 55 of your statement? And I've got some
Yes.
questions now about the audit process.
Yes.
And I want to draw your attention to 55A to start with.
Mhm.
And this is the planning process for an audit.
Yes. Yep.
And I'm looking here at would it be fair to say that a key element of the audit planning was to gain a good understanding of the risks and some compliance obligations in the area of the audit?
Yes.
And that involved a review of all relevant risk registers.
Yes, relevant to the scope. Yes.
Yes, and that was
Yep.
to identify the risks and controls relevant to the area that was being audited.
Yes, correct.
So that, by all risk registers, that means all available registers of risk that relate to the area of the audit. So not just what you saw in Cura, it was some other form of risk register as well.
I believe everything was in Cura. That's what we looked at.
If it was not in Cura, would you expect it to be something that would be brought to your attention as the auditor by the managers in question?
Yes.
Now, can I just, that's 55B. In that paragraph, you've indicated that after the planning of the scope, a scope statement was prepared, detailing the audit objectives, areas of focus, relevant risks, approach and timing for the audit. And then you've indicated there that the scope statement was provided to the relevant general manager at a meeting to discuss and agree the scope. Would you agree with the proposition that involving managers in agreeing the scope has the potential to undermine the independence and objectivity of the audit?
When I've put agree in my statement, it would have been in regards to more the timing of the audit rather than specifically what we're looking at. So we would determine what the areas we would look at, and we would go through them with the manager and advise on what we would look at. They didn't approve our scopes. There are scopes, so that agree is probably more around the timing of the audit as opposed to what we're actually auditing.
In your experience, was there any attempt by the managers to influence the focus of the audit process in these meetings?
No. If anything, I would ask have you got any concerns? Is there anything else we need to include as well? So there was certainly no, don't look at that. That never occurred.
I see. So is the effect of your evidence then that the scope of the audit was determined by the internal auditors?
Yes.
And that included the focus of the audit, what you were going to consider as part of the audit?
Yes.
Is it the case that any time managers gave you indications of areas where you should in fact be focusing that you were not?
No, I don't think so that I can recall.
Right, now in 55C,
Yes.
this is preparing the plan. In other words, the material that you would audit, or the sources of information that you would have available to you
Yes.
to carry out the audit in the way it would be done.
Yes.
I'm interested in, there's a sentence there saying it included, where relevant, observations, live and or via surveillance, sample testing of documentation, transactions, etc. Do I understand from that that part of the material available to internal audit was an ability to carry out surveillance on the gaming floor?
Yes, we would do that within the surveillance department. We would sit with an operator if we needed to perform some observations via surveillance, yeah.
And the Pearl Room?
In terms of surveillance?
Yes, access to do that?
Yes, anything that where there was cameras, we could go into surveillance and observe the footage or live.
And were there cameras also in the salons for the junkets?
Yeah, I believe there was.
And so insofar as the audits of, let's say, the table games area were concerned,
Yes.
in your experience, were any of those audits designed in a way whereby surveillance of the table games was used as part of the audit process?
Yes.
Okay. Now, can I ask you to... I'm going to ask you some specific questions now around the AML CTF program and that audit, the audit of that area in particular, because as you no doubt have picked up from the media and wherever else, that this is the focus of the inquiry. So could I ask that you be taken to CRW.704.001.5559. There is most likely a non-publication order on this document. You should have on the screen in front of you, Ms Murray, a document referred to as an AML CTF program, Crown Perth, version 12, 14 February 2014. Now, I'm just going to use this document as an example of one of the AML CTF programs that were extant in the period that you were the internal audit manager. And we don't need to look at the whole thing. I want to take you to pinpoint 0.5579, which is Appendix E, and it's referred to as Risk Assessment Designated Services. And then if we could scroll through to, there's a table that begins on page 0.5582. Now, do you recall being involved in the audit of the AML CTF program from time to time?
Yes.
No doubt, as part of that process, you had regard to the AML CTF program itself.
Yes.
And one of the documents included is this risk register in the Appendix E.
Yes, I believe so.
Correct?
Yeah.
So in terms of, going back to one of my earlier questions, which is identifying the risk registers relevant to the area of audit, this would have been one of the risk registers relevant to your area of audit for AML CTF, correct?
Yes.
Now, I've got some general questions about this, but we can go through all of them, but just if I could start with the first one, which is just the cash buy-in VIP.
Okay.
And you'll see it identifies a number of risks in connection with cash buy-ins. And there's various risks. I don't need to say them out loud. And then across under specific controls, one of the specific controls referred to is suspicious matter reporting raised by TG staff who observed customer behaviour,
Yes.
for example. And in fact, when one goes through all of the items in this table, one of the controls identified is a suspicious matter report.
Yep.
So you would agree, and this goes back to your statement, I think, one of the purposes of the audit is not only to test for compliance with a control, but to test the effectiveness of the control, correct? Now, what do you have an appreciation or understanding of what types of behaviour may lead to a suspicious matter report being generated?
Yes.
And was that based on your online training?
From memory, there were some examples, I think, in the online training what would be potentially a suspicious matter. But it wouldn't, my knowledge wouldn't be purely on completion of that training course. Reviewing the documentation, reviewing the programme, preparing the audit plan and conducting the audits would mean that I would have a greater knowledge of those other than through doing the training.
All right, so just I'll take you to one of the just let me take you an audit because I've got some questions about the way these were carried out. So if I can just take, I guess as an example again.
Okay.
This is CRW.008.002.4305. Which is an internal audit report for the AML CTF financing in June 2013. And just for noting, I note the distribution list includes Mr. Preston.
Yeah.
So Mr. Preston was effectively the person you were auditing, his department you were auditing, and he was also your line manager.
Yes.
In your view, does that have an effect on your ability to independently audit that area?
No.
And why do you say that?
The internal audit team acted autonomously within the business, so Mr. Preston wouldn't have been involved in anything to do with the audit planning or testing or the report or the like, other than if there were any issues, they would be flagged with him as part of the audit process. But the internal audit team acted independent of all management and executive.
Well, at this time, Mr. Preston was the AML CTF compliance officer.
Mm-hmm, correct.
This is effectively his compliance or his AML CTF program.
Yes.
At the meetings we referred to earlier, we had meetings with managers. Is your evidence that Mr. Preston was not participating in the meetings at which the scope of the audit was discussed?
He would have had a copy of the scope. I would have sent the exec over that area a copy, I believe. But what we would have is an entrance meeting to walk through that scope. I can't recall if Mr. Preston was at that meeting or whether it was just the AML compliance officer in the. I can't remember exactly who was at that meeting. Right. But he would have had a copy of the scope.
Right. But in all events, he's your line manager, you're auditing his department, you're reporting to him,
Yep.
and you don't see there to be any possible, if for nothing else, perception that your objectivity may be compromised in that situation.
The potential is a perception, however, that wasn't the case. In my opinion, we acted completely independent and there was no conflict. Same process was applied for any audit that we did, the executive responsible for that area would get a copy of the report, would get a copy of the scope. Mr. Preston was treated no differently from any other executive within the business, and certainly didn't influence anything in terms of what we found or how we reported it.
It may not have influenced Ms. Murray, I'm not suggesting it did, but that arrangement, would you consider that to be consistent with the internal audit international standard of independence and objectivity?
The fact that I had an administrative reporting line to Mr. Preston.
Yes, that you reported to Mr. Preston and you were auditing his area.
I don't believe so. I don't believe there was a conflict.
And why do you say there wasn't an inherent, let's put it this way, there's an inherent conflict in that situation? And again, I'm not saying it led to any influence at all, but would you not agree with me that that situation in and of itself inherently creates the potential for conflict of your duty to audit independently and your
Potentially, yeah.
Can I ask that we just look at pinpoint 0.4306 at the bottom of that page? If the operator could collect it with the top of the following page, which is 0.4307. Now, under the objectives and scope, you'll see in the second bullet point, one of the objectives is to assess the effectiveness of the controls in place. And you'll recall one of the controls is the provision of suspicious matter reports.
Yes.
And on the following page, under the heading.
Sorry to interrupt, my friend. Given the nature of the material that's actually in this report, can I ask my friend to perhaps could just confine it to the personal screens, because it obviously does deal with the nature of the tests that are done and the scoping in relation to AML CTF issues?
Yes, I think that's appropriate, Mr. Petrie.
Yes, sorry. Can we please confine it to the Commission, witness and interested parties screens, please? I hope you've still got it, Ms. Murray, have you? Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Now, on page 0.4307, there's a heading that begins, the audit include review of the following areas. And there's the effectiveness of risk assessment procedures in relation to Crown Perth's risk of facilitating money laundering and terrorism financing.
Yes.
So that would include, would it not, an assessment of whether that risk register I showed you earlier in the AML CTF program was effective in identifying appropriate risks and controls?
I believe so.
And can I draw your attention to the bullet point, the fourth bullet point, controls in place to accurately and completely identify and report information to AUSTRAC?
Yes.
As we've got, including, and one of the inclusions there is suspect transactions.
Correct.
Now, when we look at the substance of the report itself, I'll take you to 4317. there's a reference to having sampled some suspicious matter reports that
Yes.
were provided, and you were testing really to see if the reporting had been done within the time frame required under the AML-CTF Act.
Yes.
Clearly, if I'm right, just if you tell me, I'm making some assumptions, Ms. Murray, and I might be wrong about this, but when you look at the report, it doesn't describe every single aspect of the audit undertaken. It only identifies those where there were issues that were identified of a minor or more significant nature.
The executive summary has a positive outcomes section, so that would highlight, based on everything we've looked at, that would highlight all the areas that we looked at where there were no findings. So it does provide
Right.
a balance in terms of what was confirmed to be effective. And then these tables would be relating to the findings, so where we got exceptions from our testing.
All right. So, to your knowledge and recollection, was there any aspect of the AML-CTF program audit designed to test and to ascertain whether suspicious matter reports were being made when they should be made?
No, I don't know how you test that.
Well, you might test by sampling the information available in a particular area, for example, and to see if, based on the information available to that area, they were making suspicious matter reports.
Thinking of more people on the floor, but yes, there would be reports that were generated and reviewed by the Cage and by the AML, I believe, where they would review certain information, and if they formed a suspicion based on that information, we'd look at that to make sure that that was being done, that those reports were being generated and reviewed. As part of the audit, we'd also do what I'd call a walkthrough. So we'd sit with someone from the Cage, for instance, when they did the daily checks of the reports, and actually sit with them and say, what sort of things are you looking for, and actually walk through their mindset, if you like, in terms of what they're doing, in terms of checking the information, which could then potentially they would form a suspicion potentially on that information.
All right. So,
Yeah.
coming back to my question though, to your recollection and knowledge, was there any design aspect of the audit where what you were looking for was a gap? In other words, there was information available to a member of the Cage or the table games or wherever it might be that should generate a suspicious matter report but did not. To your knowledge and recollection, was there such an aspect of your audit process?
Not that I can specifically recall. There would have been detailed tests that we'd performed, but I can't remember if there's something that would specifically look at that. I can't remember.
Well, again, hypothetically,
Yeah.
you had the ability to utilise the surveillance equipment of the surveillance area.
Yes.
So it would be possible, would it not, to carry out some form of random testing and observation of behaviour on the gaming floor to see if, when particular activities were taking place, they were being identified by table game staff and reported as suspicious matters. That could be done.
It could be done, yes.
To your knowledge and understanding, was any testing of that nature done by the internal audit department?
I can't recall, I'm sorry.
Would it be fair to say that within the internal audit department you did not have people with the requisite expertise to carry out such an audit? In other words, who would be able to identify behaviour on the floor themselves and work out if it ought to have been the subject of a suspicious matter report?
don't believe that was part of the audit scope that we did, no.
It may not, if it wasn't part of the scope, that's fine, Ms. Murray, but is it, if that's the answer to the question, that is the answer to the question. I'm really trying to understand if within the scope or the planning phase,
Yes.
in particular with respect to AML and CTF auditing, one thing you had in view was, is there a gap? Is there something that our people are missing?
Yeah. And the way we would have audited that is, are people appropriately trained? So the areas of the business where they would potentially be exposed to a suspicious matter, like table games or the cage, we would test to ensure that those people have been adequately trained. They've got SOPs in place, which they're aware of and they're following in terms of what they need to do. I think for those specific areas, there was not just the online training, there was other training that was conducted for those areas of the business that potentially would be more exposed to these sort of transactions, and so we would make sure that that training had been conducted for those people. So that's how we would audit that, make sure that those people on the floor are aware of, have a good understanding, are appropriately trained to be able to form a suspicion.
All right. Remembering that one of the controls identified in the risk register is suspicious matter reporting. How are you testing to identify if that control was effective? In other words, people were making such reports when they should have been making them, not just look at the ones they made and were they appropriate.
Yeah, no, I understand what you're asking. No, it wasn't something we looked at as part of the audit.
All right. Could I ask to show you another audit as an example? This is CRW.709. .132.7527, and again, can we keep this one off the public screen, please? This, you should have in front of you, Ms. Murray, an internal audit for the telegraphic transfers. It's dated September 2014. And here you'll see the distribution list is Mr. McGregor, Mr. Brown, Mr. Preston and Ms. Kessel.
Yes.
So it's going to, if you like, those departments that have something to do with telegraphic transfers, i.e. finance with Mr. McGregor and Ms. Kessel.
Yes.
The cage, who are responsible for part of that process.
Yep.
And it's also gone to Mr. Preston, presumably because of the AML CTF aspect to this area of the business.
No, it would have gone to Mr. Preston because Mr. Brown reported through to him. So he would, at that period of time, he would have been responsible for the cage.
I see.
Yeah, that's why he would have got that.
All right. So can I take you to pinpoint? Well, while on the topic, if you look at CRW, pinpoint .7528, it may explain the overall management comment is given by Mr. Brown.
Yep.
And there's also a comment there from Ms. Kessel as the financial controller.
Yes.
A little, if I could take you now to pinpoint 7529.
Mhm.
And again, I want to draw your attention to the audit objectives and scope.
Yes.
And the second last one includes, I'm going to use the shorthand, AUSTRAC reporting requirements have been complied with where applicable.
Yes.
Now, you understood that one of the requirements of AUSTRAC was to make a suspicious matter report where events gave rise to a suspicious matter.
Yes.
And am I right in understanding that one of the things that was or should have been the subject of this audit was the extent to which people in the cage and in the finance area were identifying transactions of a suspicious nature and making reports to AUSTRAC in respect of them.
I'm just trying to think what that would have related to, whether it was suspicious matter reports, or whether it would have been threshold transaction reports. Possibly both, but I can't recall the detail behind the
Well, there's
objectives.
threshold transactions, there's suspicious transactions, there's international funds transfer.
The FTs, yeah.
So they're all things that should be in view of the cage and finance, aren't they not?
Yes.
So when one's talking about considering if requirements have been met, it must be all AUSTRAC requirements, surely, that's irrelevant to that department.
I can't remember. Yes, potentially. There'd be a lot of detail behind this scope on what we would actually look at,
Yes.
which I can't recall specifically what we would have looked at.
Well, can I do, this might help you, on page pinpoint 7530, it has a description of the audit approach and focus.
Yep.
One of the things was a review of the casino manual, section 3, capital A. Do you recall that to be the main bank section of the casino manual?
Yes, I think it was, yes.
And the standard operating procedures for the telegraphic transfer.
Yes. Yep.
And you undertook some performance testing on a sample of those telegraphic transfers.
Yes.
Now, again, the question really is, again, this follows a similar form to the previous audit report where it does identify some positive outcomes and opportunities for improvement.
Yep.
My question really is whether you can recall, and to your knowledge, was one of the aspects of the audit focusing on whether there was a gap, that is to say, there was information available to those in either the cage or the finance area that should have led to a suspicious matter report being generated but did not?
Yes, potentially.
Potentially, or do you recall that being an aspect of the scope of the telegraphic transfer audit?
I can't honestly remember. It was so long ago, I can't remember specifically what tests we would have performed in relation to this audit.
Okay, can I just ask you if you could look at CRW .529.0001.9093. This will be a non-publication probably as well. It's the Crown Cage standard operating procedures for telegraphic transfers.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if this might assist you to some extent in reminding you what information was available to review. And probably the easiest place to start is, Murray, if I could take you to pinpoint 9100. And there's a TTR checklist.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a heading there, completing a TT release.
Yes.
And there's a number of boxes which one might regard as bullet points for this purpose. There are the four last ones refer to the information that was part of the telegraphic transfer release form. And is it your understanding that in the course of the audit, when one is auditing the materials available for, you were dealing with all of those aspects of the telegraphic transfer. That's to say, the patron number in the psycho system, the TA number allocated to it, the comments, valuation, etc.
Yes.
And there were a number of documents attached to the telegraphic transfer release. Just trying to find where that's. Sorry, it's on the, so the very last bullet point on that page says split up the paperwork as follows, and then if we could move to the next page, it's 9101. And then you'll see there were four copies. As part of the audit, were you auditing to ensure that there was correspondence between each of the areas that received copies, as much as whether each individual one had its appropriate paperwork?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. And this might now be straddling different. This particular one does deal with the finance department and Cage. There are four areas that receive a copy. There's a white copy that goes to the appeal room Cage.
Yeah.
And it has the original documentation, printouts, etc.
Mm.
A yellow copy, which goes to the finance department.
Yeah.
A blue copy that goes to income and control. Who were they?
Income control. They were a department within the finance team.
So do I understand from that the finance got two copies in two different areas?
Yes.
And then a pink copy was filed in the release file.
Release file, which would have been in the Cage probably.
Do you recall carrying out an audit of this material? Do you remember what was in the bundles?
It would have been 10 years since I did the audit. I can't recall. This does refresh my memory a little bit, but certainly the audit process would have validated that this process was being followed in terms of who got what. I can't remember what the documentation would have been that supported their forms.
And do you have any understanding of what, say for example, the two copies that go to the finance department, what the purpose of them receiving it was?
So one went to the accountant. So the accountant, they would do the bank reconciliations. So maybe it was part of the reason why they needed that documentation, potentially. Income control. Why would finance need it? There would have been a reason, I just can't recall. They needed to have that information. It would have been in relation to in terms of what they did with the banks, I would say, in terms of understanding those transactions. I can't remember.
All right. In distinction to the circumstance where you might be trying to work out if a suspicious matter report should have been made based on observations in the gaming room areas, in this instance, there were all the information that one might need to determine if a transaction that was a subject of a TT release form was suspicious was available to the audit team?
It depends on the information that was provided on the documentation. Yeah, so for instance, if the bank statement was attached to that and we saw, multiple transactions and then they had been aggregated on the form, we'd see that as part of the information that we were auditing.
If that were the case, and you immediately mentioned aggregation on a form,
Yeah.
is that as a consequence of you following what's been happening in this commission, is it?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Do you have any independent recollection of seeing such a form during an audit?
No, I'm sorry, I don't recall.
All right. But you would agree with me, would you not, that you could have designed an audit process whereby you took an adequate sample size
Mm-hmm.
to determine if there were any gaps in the reporting of suspicious matters derived from telegraphic transfer release forms?
Yes, obviously an audit's at a point in time looking at a sample. So, but yes, if those transactions were the subject of our sampling, then yes.
Now, no doubt, you've heard the name Riverbank Investments. If not, when you were at Crown Perth, you have heard of it in more recent times. The questions I'm going to ask you, I have been asking you, Ms. Murray, are quite important from the perspective of understanding the history of the way in which events that have been revealed by the Bergin inquiry came to pass,
Mm-hmm.
and it will assist this commission for the future to understand how that may be avoided, a repeat of similar kinds of things in the future.
Yes.
So you are no doubt aware of the Bergin inquiry report.
I'm aware there is a report, yes.
Are you aware in a general sense that one of the findings of that report was that there was an account in the name of Riverbank Investments at the Crown Perth Casino that was used to facilitate money laundering for a number of years?
I'm aware it talks to the Riverbank account. I wasn't aware of that level of detail.
All right. So I'm paraphrasing the finding, and I may not got it exactly accurate, but one of the findings in the Bergin inquiry was that the Riverbank Investments account was not used by Crown itself, but by other people to facilitate money laundering for many years, and those years coincided with and spanned the period that you're the internal audit manager.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now, you might also be aware that earlier this week the Commission heard evidence from Ms. van der Klaar, and when she was asked in 2020 to undertake a review of the Riverbank Investments accounts,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things she looked at were the bank statements and these telegraphic transfer release forms. And on her review, she found numerous examples where there were these instances of aggregation without a suspicious matter report having been prepared. And the period of her analysis was from July 2013 to July 2017.
Okay.
For the purposes of assisting this commission, is there any reason of which you are aware that would explain the failure of the internal audits of the telegraphic transfers and the AML-CTF program to identify that there had been a number of instances where suspicious matter reports should have been but were not made?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Is there anything that you can assist the Commission to provide us with information
Mm-hmm.
as to why none of the internal audits undertaken in the period you were the internal audit manager identified that failing to provide suspicious matter reports in respect of aggregation?
obviously the audits that we do is at a point in time, and we look at a sample basis. So all I can suggest is obviously it hadn't been part of our sample, those transactions.
You weren't really looking for that gap though, were you? You were not looking for the gap of the kind that ultimately transpired. You weren't looking to see if suspicious matter reports should have been but were not being made.
We would have been looking at the process around the TTs, so we would have been looking at the bank statements and that had been followed through due process. We wouldn't have been looking at for that gap, because I'm quite surprised that was occurring. Hearing about it now, it wouldn't have been something that we would have been looking for, but if we'd have seen it as part of the testing, we would have highlighted it.
That's the point of internal audit, isn't it? Is to find the things that no one knows about.
Yeah. On a sample basis, you can't purely rely on internal audit to pick up these things.
Okay. I'm not intending to criticise your
No.
process. It's just, if there was anything at all you could think of that might, bearing in mind, one of the things we are interested in is the future.
Mm.
Can I ask that you be shown now CRW .709.144.1624, which is, I don't know if I've taken you to this already,
Standards.
Ms. Murray, or not. You mentioned in paragraph 50 the Institute of Internal Auditors standard. Do you recognise that to be one version of it? This is the revised version in October 2012.
Yes.
I just want to ask you some questions about this standard in the context of the internal audit process at Crown Perth at the time. Could I take you to pinpoint standard? It's on point 1629. And for the purposes of this standard, you were the Chief Audit Executive, were you not?
Yes.
And looking now under the next heading, which is independence and objectivity, there are where this standard refers to must, it's a non-negotiable item, is it not? So it says must, it means exactly that. Must be independent and must be objective.
Yes.
And in the interpretation area, it makes reference to achieve the degree of independence necessary to effectively carry out the responsibilities of the internal audit activity. The Chief Audit Executive, that's you, has direct and unrestricted access to senior management and the board. Now, your evidence is you reported administratively to Mr. Preston,
Yes.
actually to the ERCC, which was an executive committee.
Yes.
You made some reports to Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen.
Mm-hmm.
You did not have any direct report to any member or to the board itself of Burswood Limited, did you?
Only via Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Barton. That was, I guess, my access to the board, because they were members of the board.
All right. So you saw the access to the board as being via Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, each of them were also executives, were they not, of the of Crown Resorts Limited?
Yes, I believe so.
So insofar as independence and objectivity goes, in your mind, did you have any access to the independent directors, as to say, Mr. Point and Mr. Roberts at this time?
No.
And so do you consider that having access to Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen meets the requirement of access to unrestricted access to the board?
That was how it had been set up prior to me even being in that role. That was the reporting lines that had already been established.
But you were the internal audit manager. You were the charter required you to carry out the audits in accordance with the standard. Did you consider at the time that the degree of access you had to the members of the Burswood Limited board to be sufficient to be required as to meet the standard of independence required by the standard?
I believed it was at the time, yeah.
And why did you believe that?
As I mentioned, because I had direct access to Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Barton, so at the time that's what I believed.
Okay. Can I ask you to look at the next standard, which is organisational independence? This is on page 1630. And this is again dealing with the manner in which the Chief Audit Executive confirms aspects of the internal audit function, and under the interpretation it gives some examples of the ways in which organisational independence is effectively achieved. And the examples are approving the internal audit charter. Now, in your case, that was approved by the ERCC, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
It wasn't approved by the Burswood Limited board.
I don't recall it going to the board in my tenure. I believe it was just the ERCC.
And I think you've given evidence that you understood the internal audit plan, which is the strategic audit plan, to ultimately have made its way to the board.
Yes.
But the intervening step there was approval by the ERCC, wasn't it?
Yes, approval, endorsement. I'm not sure specifically how it was captured. My understanding was ultimately it was approved by the board.
Now, as part of the strategic audit plan, the internal budget and resourcing was dealt with in that plan, wasn't it?
In the strategic audit plan.
Yeah, either in the strategic audit plan or in your dealings with Mr. Preston, in terms of resourcing of the internal audit department.
What's the question?
I'm dealing here with what organ of the Crown Perth was responsible for approving the internal audit budget and resource plan.
So who approved our internal audit budget and resource plan? So I'm not sure of the exact the budget process. I prepared a draft budget which was provided to Mr. Preston and Mr. Felsted, and then there was a internal review process around budgets. The formal approval of the actual budget, I can't recall if it went to the board or not, or whether it was just CFO.
What I mean to say is you were not directly going to the board and saying this is the budget and these are the resources I need to carry out my functions internally.
No.
Now, am I right in thinking that the next bullet point, which is receiving communications from the internal audit, would be via your communication with Mr. Barton and Mr. Nielsen?
Yeah, so they would receive the internal audit activity report. My understanding is that formed part of the Burswood board pack, so that they would get that report.
Now, I've forgotten what your answer was to an earlier question I asked you about who appointed you as the internal audit manager. Who was that again?
It would have been Mr. Preston in conjunction with Mr. Felston, I would say.
All right. So the decisions around your appointment and your remuneration were not made by the board directly by the board of Burswood Limited, were they? They were made by Mr. Preston.
No, they weren't.
Beg your pardon?
No, they weren't.
Were not made by Mr. Preston or by the board?
By the board. Yeah. I'm not sure around my appointment if there was any discussions with Mr. Nielsen and Mr. Barton. I wasn't privy to that in terms of whether they have any formal say in that.
Now, did you receive any communications from Mr. Barton, Mr. Nielsen, or any other member of the Burswood Limited board in which questions were asked of you directly about whether you considered yourself to have sufficient resources to carry out the internal audit function? What about on scope of audit? Were any of those people involved in asking you directly questions about the scope of the audit and its appropriateness?
Not that I can recall.
Can I draw your attention to the next heading, which is direct interaction with the board? And it indicates that the chief audit executive must communicate and interact directly with the board. In the time that you were the internal audit manager for Crown Perth, do you consider that you were communicating and interacting directly with the Burswood Limited board?
No, probably not.
Can I ask you to just turn now to paragraph 70 of your statement. In which you've expressed the opinion that you considered Crown Perth's internal audit regime has been robust and the best you're involved in during your career. Can I ask you to consider whether you adhere to that statement in light of some of the answers to the questions you've just given in relation to the standard, the internal audit standard? Do you adhere to the statement that it was a robust regime?
That statement relates to our internal audit process, if you like. So I believe we did the best we could in terms of identifying the risks and the controls and doing appropriate planning to do a detailed audit. We were thorough in documenting everything and tracking all those actions to make sure they were completed. So from the audit process, yes, I believe we were robust. And I believe that was highlighted through the independent review of internal audit by the IAA. However, having looked at the specifics in the state and the standards in relation to that direct access to the board, yeah, that does appear to be a bit of a weakness.
And it's a weakness primarily because it undermines the independence of the audit function from management.
Yeah, I agree.
And so the structure that you were perhaps forced to deal with during the time you were the independent audit had a structural failure, didn't it, in that respect?
Yeah, I should have had direct access to the chair of the board or the non-execs in hindsight. yes, that would have ensured that strong independence. Yeah, agree.
And yeah, thanks. I'll just ask you to look again at paragraph 69 of your statement.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, it probably reflects well on you, Ms. Murray, and the way you conducted yourself as the internal audit manager. But is it possible that you didn't experience any, as you described it, pushback from departments because, in effect, you were not sufficiently independent from the management and the managers involved?
No.
You don't agree with that?
No.
It would be. Would you agree with me with the proposition that it would be unusual for the internal audit team to not receive at least some pushback from the management?
Pushback in terms of what specifically?
As in probing into areas where perhaps they didn't want you to go.
No, we had free access to anything we needed to look at. There was not that I'm aware of any pushback from anyone in terms of not being able to access any specific documentation or any.
Okay, so can I just on that theme, I want to ask you a question, if I might. You might recall a little earlier I took you to the Institute of Internal Auditors report in November 2014, which is CRW.701.005.8210. And if I could just take you to pinpoint 8225. And there's a table there. Can I just draw your attention to the table? And it's dealing with internal audit recommendations overdue for implementation in the period 2009 to 2014. And there does appear to be a trend in terms of overdue implementations in that period. Have you, do you recall now whether that was a trend that continued after 2014 until the end of your time?
I can't recall specifically.
What was the process by which you sought to, if you like, bring the recalcitrant managers into line in implementing their recommendations?
So for each internal audit report that we issued, we had management comments in terms of how they would address the audit findings, and they would set a target date for when that action would be completed by, and that's the actions that we would then track until they had actually been implemented. So we some of the dates, I guess, over time were not realistic when they first agreed them in the report. So potentially things took longer than they anticipated, which was why we would have actions that would potentially take longer to implement. So we would track those actions, and that was and do follow-ups when they were due to get a status update on those actions. And that was reported in a similar format to this in my paper that I did for the ERCC and the board. So at a high level they could see where those actions weren't being implemented on a timely basis. So yeah, we would do regular follow-up and get status updates on those to see what was happening with those actions.
But nearly 100 outstanding at the end of 2014 is quite a few.
Would you? Yes, agree.
And so would you agree with me that pushback can be either direct or indirect, can it not?
I don't think it was pushback in terms of they don't want to do it. It was more the case of, for instance, it would be changes to systems and the like. So they might take a significant amount of time to actually update a system. So I don't think it was necessarily pushback on we don't want to implement the actions. It was more it's taken longer than we anticipated.
Well, doesn't it reflect a lack of priority given to implementing recommendations of the internal audit?
Yes, potentially.
And was there no means by which you could bring about, as I said earlier, those who were laggards to bring them into line?
I might just interrupt for a moment. There's a couple of questions that my friend has now put to the witness which assume a position, for example, that people were recalcitrant in performing. And the question that my friend just put, there's actually no evidence that my friend has taken the witness to actually support that underlying assumption.
Yeah, I think the witness said that there could be any one of a number of reasons, including it that require system changes, all sorts of things. So the question is, I think, being put in on a hypothetical basis, is it not?
It's really been put on the basis that there were 96 outstanding recommendations in 2014. I'm asking the witness if she took any steps to try and bring those that were outstanding to complete the outstanding recommendations.
Well, you can certainly ask that. In terms of what was happening in the period immediately after 2014 in relation to those the recommendations that at that stage had not been implemented.
And the expression laggard was in reference to the lagging recommendations. So did you take any steps after 2014 to bring about completion of the 96 outstanding recommendations?
In terms outside of the normal audit process, we would obviously we didn't just leave them overdue. We followed up with each responsible person and got an understanding as to why it hadn't been done, what was the delay, what was the rationale for that, and that would be documented with either, well, back then it would have been on a spreadsheet, but at a later date we track them in Cura. So we had rationale as to why they weren't being done. If we thought that wasn't reasonable, then we would escalate that. But we would, at least every quarter in preparation for the ERCC meetings, anything that had fallen overdue was followed up within the team.
And to whom did you escalate it when you had that need?
That would have been flagged with the relevant, depends on the level of the person who was responsible for that action. It would probably have been flagged with their manager. If I had a concern, I might have also flagged it with Mr. Preston. But within my internal audit activity report, it has a similar table in there now, and I would actually, where there was significant findings, because one thing this doesn't state is the rating attached to that finding. So these might be minor opportunity for improvement actions. They might not be significant actions. So my focus would be on anything of significance in terms of how it's been rated. And then those significant ones, I would then drill down into what are they? Why aren't we actioning them? And you'd see in my internal audit activity report, I would highlight some of the ones that were dragging and what they were and the reasons for them. So yeah, it might be 96, but majority of those could potentially be low, minor findings. So you'd need the context around around those findings, really.
Thank you, Ms Murray.
Yeah.
I have no further questions.
Thank you, Mr. Futrell. Are there any applications? Mr. Gareth?
Yes, there is. Thank you, Commissioner. Just while we're on this document, can we turn through to page 8214, please? I should say, Ms Murray, Garris is my name. I act for the Crown Companies. Can I just direct your attention to paragraph 1.4 of the page you see on screen, and I'll just indicate the assessment as described there is that there is general conformance to the standards and the IAA Code of Ethics, and that this is the highest rating that can be given. Now, in relation to two particular areas, I want to direct your attention to section 1100, independence and objectivity, and 1130, impairment to independence or objectivity. Would either or both of those areas cover the very matters that Mr. Futrell was discussing with you in relation to communications with the board and independence?
Those are, yes.
Thank you. And the colour coding on the right indicates what? The green.
If you could just scroll up, it says on above, I think.
If you go to page
there's a key
8213,
somewhere.
please. No, 8213, the previous page.
I'm not sure. I haven't seen this report for a long time.
So is that the legend that you're looking for on the left-hand
Yes.
side there?
Yep. So green. Yep. So there's. Yeah, generally conforms with the standards.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now, more broadly, I just want to understand and get you to explain to the Commission what you understand the distinction to be in relation to audits between the concept of reasonable assurance versus absolute assurance or guarantees.
Reasonable assurance is based on the information as part of the audit at a point in time, based on a sample or a period that you've looked at. You can provide reasonable assurance around that control environment, the effectiveness of the controls and how the risk is being managed. Whereas absolute assurance is you're absolutely sure and you've looked at everything, which is something that we wouldn't have done. We would have provided reasonable assurance.
Thank you. And in relation to the example that Mr. Futrell took you to regarding the TTs,
yes,
and the audits in relation to that. Now, you explained that within the sample size that you were dealing with, that obviously some issues were picked up. It doesn't appear that the particular problem identified by the Bergin report was picked up. Now, and you indicated in your evidence that it was probably a consequence of the fact that the sample size, or at least those particular transactions within that sample, did show that problem. Is that an accurate summary of the evidence you gave?
yes.
Now, is it the case that even if that sample size was greater, the problem may still not have been picked up?
Potentially, yeah. It's
And
random sampling, so yeah,
And
potentially.
that is a consequence, as I understand it, of the fact that it's about reasonable assurance in relation to auditing. Is that correct?
Yes, correct.
Thank you. The last question that I have, Ms. Murray, is just in relation to the training that you've listed in the attachment to your witness statement. Now,
Yes,
as I understand it, the table that you've included commences in the financial year 2012, but is it the case that you received training before that year as well?
yes,
And
yes.
was there AML training that you received before that?
I believe so. I think it was part of the onboarding that those were one of the mandatory courses that I would have done. Yes.
Thank you. And in relation to the training that you undertook in 2015. And if we just go, please, to page 13, it's the fourth row from the bottom. Mr. Futrell took you to this previously.
Yes.
And it's the AML CTF training. Now, having regard to your experience and your understanding of AML issues, did you consider that particular training to be sufficient for you at that time?
For me, it gave a high level understanding of the key components of AML CTF. So the course was designed for all employees to complete, so it was pitched at that high level. So yeah, it gave me, I guess, a baseline in terms of understanding. Whether there could have been more training, if it was available, I don't know if it was available. That would have been something that I would have attended to help with my knowledge of the area.
Thank you. No further questions, Commissioners.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Garrett. Ms. Murray, I've just got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you.
Yes.
Do you recall when Mr. Futrell took you to the audit chart, the internal audit charter?
Yes.
There were really three areas in terms of lines of responsibility, if you like. One was reporting, and I think it's reported directly to the CEO and the ERCC.
Yes.
That was one, reported directly. Another was direct access to the General Counsel and also to the CFO of Crown Resorts Limited.
Yes.
And the third was that that internal audit was accountable to the ERCC. Could I ask you, looking at that, those three terms in terms of when you're looking at various types or indicia of responsibility,
Yes.
what you see as the ultimate responsibility from all of those three?
The ultimate would be the board, and I would probably say it should have said accountable to the board, not the ERCC. In hindsight, having a look at the charter now, ultimately, internal audit is accountable to the board.
Did you appreciate at the time? I am asking you about the time. Did you appreciate that the ERCC was not in classical governance terms a committee of the board, but rather within the management structure?
Yes.
You appreciated that?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And my other question relates to junkets.
Yep.
I think you said to Mr. Futrell, in answer to Mr. Futrell's questions, that part of the audit plan was the auditing of the junket approval process. Is that right?
Junket operations broadly, yes.
Right, junket operations,
Yes.
which would have included the approval process.
Yes, from memory, yes.
Okay. Now, I want to test your memory.
Okay.
From 2008 to 2011, you were a member of the audit team, and then from 2011, you became the audit manager.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to focus on that period, 2008 to 2011.
Okay.
Were you personally, from memory, can you recall whether you personally were involved in any aspect of the audit of the junket operations?
Now I do a junkets audit. I can't answer definitively. I reckon I would have done an audit because I was an auditor for 3.5 years, and I know we would have done that audit every other year, so it's likely I did, but I can't honestly remember
And
specifically.
so then, is it unlikely that you could recall the scope of any audit in which you were personally involved in relation to junkets?
I know it would have been aligned to the casino manual because there was a section in the casino manual around junket operations. So the scope really would have been validating the procedures in the casino manual were being followed. Those specific tests that I would have done, I know there was an approval process for junkets. I can't recall if that was who was involved in that, but I know we would have validated the junket had been approved in accordance with what it would have been stated in the casino manual as the
All right,
process.
well, I won't pursue it because any answer that you might give to the question I wanted to ask
Yeah.
wouldn't have sufficient value, so I won't.
Sorry.
Mr. Gandhi, do you wish to re-examine?
No, Commissioner, I have no further questions for this
All right,
witness.
thank you. Ms. Murray, thank you very much for your evidence. That's been of assistance to us. We will leave the summons in place because there's a third commissioner who will have to review the process, and so we may have tidy up questions. I think it's unlikely, but we may have so. And you'll be advised by the solicitors assisting the commission when the summons has been lifted.
Okay.
But in the meantime, you're of course free to resume your normal activities, and you have our gratitude for.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
and we'll adjourn to 2 p.m.